All right, what is up, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Practical Planner Podcast. I'm your co-host, Thomas Kopelman. Here with me is Anne Rhodes, Chief Legal Officer of Wealth.com. Anne, what's up? I feel like we have not spoken in so long because I was gone for my wedding and honeymoon.
I know it. I think you and I are both undergoing major life events. So we should be talking probably about why you should update your estate plan with the two of us as the poster children for people who need to update their plans. I actually am expecting a child. So if you're watching this, through our YouTube channel or whatever, you won't be able to tell because, of course, the frame cuts it off. But I am 7 months pregnant. So I will be updating my estate plan pretty soon because my current estate plan doesn't even name my first child, who's 3. So do as I say, not as I do.
Yeah, I actually just got mine done as well. I did mine in the very beginning before I got engaged, and then recently just actually went through and did mine at Wealth. Now that we're married, set up the trust. Now I need to go get it notarized and get all of that done. But very good prompt for everybody listening that, marriage, having kids, potentially moving if you move different states are very good times to update your estate plan. But before we hop into this topic, I just want to let everybody know we've been getting a lot of questions DM'd to us on social media. Our goal, again, with this podcast is really to be like the go-to resource for financial advisors, teaching you about estate planning and all the questions that you might have. So we've now set up an email. It's the practicalplanner@wealth.com. It's just practicalplanner@wealth.com. If you email that, we'll be responding and we'll bring those questions to different podcast episodes. We haven't really decided if we're going to do like full episodes or if we'll just kind of end some episodes with questions that have been submitted, but feel free to send any questions our way. Anne's not going to give you legal advice, so she's not going to tell you exactly what to do with your client by any means, but we'll talk about different topics and help educate you on those different things that you're seeing. But let's hop into today's episode. So today what we're really going to be talking about is marital trust. So I'm sure everybody has heard of them. Some people use them in practice very often if you work with blended families in certain situations like that. Others maybe not use them so much, but I think it's a really important topic. So Anne, let's just really start this conversation with, what are marital trusts? And then let's go into just why people would even consider using them.
Yeah, absolutely. And this question, this topic actually came through the support channel at Wealth, and the advisor, had some very, very thoughtful questions. And so I just thought, why not address this in a podcast episode as well? Because then I get to, go a little deeper into sort of the topic. And so just to start, marital trusts, thankfully, are one of those trust types where by and large, everybody calls them marital trusts. That's not always the case with some of these other kinds of irrevocable trusts that could be formed either during the person's life or a death. But by and large, I think everyone in the industry calls this a marital trust. What it is a vehicle that you set up that's irrevocable for your spouse to receive assets. It doesn't always need to be the spouse, right? So there are, folks who are in domestic partnerships or other, long-term committed relationships. The trust is still by and large called a marital trust, even if you may not specifically be married. But it's basically, an irrevocable trust to control some sort of aspect of how your romantic partner, your long-term partner, is going to receive assets. Usually, this trust is put in place for 3 main reasons. The first 2 are really the big ones. The first one is kind of some sort of, concern from the person who might pass away with these assets about how their spouse will use the assets while they're alive, or at their death, once, anything that remains of those assets at the spouse's death, that those assets will not end up with the second level preferred beneficiaries of that decedent. So here, think very typically blended family structure. you have a second marriage or a later marriage and kids from a previous relationship, that, things can go wrong with families, or you already know that your family doesn't, get along very well. And so in that instance, to make sure that whatever is left of your assets at your spouse's death, once they've passed away, 20 years after you've passed away, that whatever remains of those assets do go to your kids, including the kids from a previous marriage. So that's the control component. And we just call it control because it's easier to understand. Of course, in front of a client, maybe use a word that's a little bit less triggering, as it were. The second reason where you might want to have a marital trust and realize that this is a completely independent reason from the control, reason that we just talked about, is tax planning. So there is something called the generation skipping transfer tax, which affects, folks who have, are high net worth, ultra high net worth. They want to be preserving as much exemption as they can for future generations. The GST tax exemption is not portable, unlike the unified gift and estate tax exemption. So if you have a decedent where it's really important to try to capture that before it's lost forever, you have to put in place some sort of structure, usually the marital trust if they have a spouse, to assign GST tax exemption to it and be able to preserve assets in a GST exempt trust.
Can you go a little bit more into that and what that
Sure.
actually means and like how that actually works in practice?
Yeah,
And maybe using
absolutely.
an example would be the most helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. So the first reason why this becomes important is that you have a client who's just been making lifetime gifts. And some of them are not taxable gifts. Maybe they use the annual $18,000 exclusion, but some of them actually have become taxable, right? And you may not even know that the client has done this because they may not have been very good about filing gift tax returns either. But when they pass away and you have to file the estate tax return, this Form 706, all of a sudden when CPAs are doing whatever they're doing and you're gathering paperwork for them, you realize, oh my gosh, like 20 years ago, they made a huge gift to their kid for their, a down payment on a house or paying for a wedding or something like that. And that client has made a taxable gift that needs to be reported to the IRS, but they never got an opportunity to also use up GST tax exemption for that gift. So GST tax exemption is very interesting. It is the exact same amount as the estate tax exemption. So think currently 13.61 million per, US person. But the two buckets are tracked separately, and they're tracked through your gift tax return and eventually, the estate tax return. It's a total construct of the tax code, by the way, both of those numbers, right? So somebody, in the client's life, ideally would be tracking these numbers as they're living their lives, gifting, doing planning, etc. So here you have your client who made an outright gift. They literally just wrote, let's say, a $200,000 check to their kid for that down payment on the home. And so they used, $200,000 of their estate tax exemption because it's also unified with a gift. So gift and estate tax exemption, they used $200,000. But they never used $200,000 of the GST tax exemption, because really the only way you use GST tax exemption is if you made a gift in a trust or some sort of structure where that asset, the $200,000, gets to grow and appreciate and just always be exempt and then get passed on to a grandchild potentially, right? So when you write that check, $200,000 directly, your estate planner, if you're ultra high net worth as a client, is probably like so upset with you because you could have made that gift through a trust that is GST tax exempt and then cut the check through the trustee to the child. And it would have been much more efficient. So this is how the numbers between the estate and gift tax exemptions start to depart from the GST exemption number. So very often you have clients who have two different numbers and you got to track the two buckets in separately. So you have this client who passes away. It matters to them to preserve the GST exemption. How do they do it? They have more GST exemption than they do the estate exemption. For the estate exemption, you form a bypass trust, and we can talk about that in a different episode. Whatever you capture of, the exemption for the gift and estate tax, you stick it into a bypass trust. Maybe it's even at the state level if you have a state that has a lower exemption number, right? But your bypass trust is supposed to be that like ultra tax exempt structure. So yeah, whatever that estate tax exemption number is, so let's say your client passes away with $2 million left, stick it into a bypass trust, that's your $2 million trust. At the same time, assign a little bit of the GST exemption to that trust. So now 2 million of your GST exemptions also been used for the bypass trust. This is your super not taxable trust. But then for that client, they have like other GST exemption left. Let's say they had 5 million total. You use 2 million for the bypass trust. What do you do with that 3 million? This is where the marital trust comes in. The marital trust can be assigned GST exemption as well. And so the marital trust can soak up GST exemption. You form shares of the marital trust, one that's GST exempt. That's a very important one. And then the other stuff, if they had more than 3 million, like that's non-exempt. But then when that share passes to the descendants, this is the ultimate play. They have a share coming to them that is GST exempt because, the first parent's exemption was assigned to it. So they get extra GST exemption. You manage to preserve it. You manage to capture it through a trust structure to pass it on to the kids and the grandkids and the great-grandkids.
Gotcha.
So that's the play. Yeah.
Super helpful. I think that example made way more sense. Okay, so that's reason number 2. Right now we're on reason number 3.
Mm-hmm. And reason number 3, it's a little less important, I think, for spouses in clients' minds than for children or descendants, but it's asset protection. To the extent that you have an irrevocable trust, always consider whether or not there's an asset protection play here. So think, your spouse, is elderly, might get into an accident someday, a creditor comes after them, and just to preserve some sort of trust structure where their inheritance from you is completely protected, that's always a good play.
Okay. So those are the 3 main reasons, and you got into a lot about, or control, tax purposes, et cetera. Do you have to structure them differently to have control versus tax benefits?
Yes, I am so glad that you asked this question. So when you have a client who is mostly motivated by these concerns, the control concerns, right? So like spouse might get remarried to, stereotypically, right, like the pool boy or something, and completely disinherit your kids, whatever. Or actually, for most people, even if you're not concerned about that, you might be concerned about elderly abuse, right? So all of a sudden, they fall, they're vulnerable as an older, widow, let's say, and all of a sudden, some, caretaker is like taking advantage of them and becomes adopted by your spouse, late in life. And all of a sudden there's like a big fight once your spouse passes away and you just want to protect your kids, right? So people put in place marital trust for quote unquote control reasons, for all sorts of reasons, but be very careful with these control reasons because depending on how much, control you impose on your spouse, you may actually be doing a disfavor with tax concerns. So if you have a client who is not worried about taxes at all, you can structure that trust pretty restrictively. As an example, you could say, this marital trust will terminate and pass to my children, either upon my spouse, passing away, or actually upon her remarriage. We see that request quite a bit, right? And so it's like, as soon as you get remarried, I'm sorry, honey, but like, that's when my stuff goes to my kids, right? Because I think that you'll be okay on your own with your new spouse.
Feels really interesting, actually. I know, I totally believe that happens, that feels very interesting. Like while being in a relationship with somebody else, being like, well, hey, if you get remarried, you better remarry somebody wealthy. Because if you want to pick not based on wealth, well, I'm taking all the money away and giving it to the kids anyways. So like figure it out. Like that's kind of a weird, like almost shackle you have on your life if that were to happen.
So Thomas, it's so funny you should mention that because we do try to walk our clients away from that because we're like, that's a really weird incentive. You realize that like there are ways for somebody to like become domestic partners, like share their lives and financial lives with someone without actually being married. So it's truthfully what you want to disincentivize, like the marriage itself, which is the real trigger, like, you know. But anyways, so there are folks who might want to ask for that, right? Or they might want to restrict how often the spouse can ask for money, or rather also, you know, give complete control to a trustee, let's say like a child, over the moms, the widows, like way, you know, distributions from the trust. All of those restrictions about control actually destroy something that's called the qualified terminable interest property rules. So if in the United States, like you can pass unlimited numbers of assets at your death to two types of people. One is your spouse, your surviving spouse, and very much you have to be married for this one for it to be recognized. And the second is charities. And so for a lot of folks who worry about taxes, passing things to your spouse, you're like kicking the tax can down the road, because your spouse gets everything. Like Jeff Bezos could give $1 billion to, you know, his spouse, and it would be completely tax-free. And the tax would only be paid at the second death. So by putting in place this marital trust as a wrapper around your spouse's inheritance, you have to meet very specific rules called the Qualified Terminable Interest Property Rules, so QTIP. It's found in section 2056B7 of the code. And so that trust cannot be too restrictive, because otherwise it breaks those rules. It no longer satisfies the QTIP rules. And so you have to weigh, you know, as an estate planner or as a client, like or as an advisor, understanding that if your client really wants restrictive, you know, controls over the spouse and their marital trust, all of a sudden you're jeopardizing the unlimited marital deduction. So you got to weigh the cost and benefits of the control versus the tax planning there.
That's really interesting to think about. I mean, on your side of this, like, how did you navigate these conversations? Because one thing that I find when I talk to clients about a lot of these is, like, obviously there's a lot of education of tools and options and things that you want to do. But in my experience, most people kind of already have like a general idea of like, well, one, at least this is what I hear the most. One is like, people come in and they're like, I actually don't care about estate taxes at all. We're going to spend our money when we pass away. If estate taxes happen, that's fine. But normally that does go hand in hand with complexity. Like there are a lot of people who are like, I just don't want any complexity, like multiple trusts, different trustees, how the taxes are paid. Like all of that just seems like it's going to add more complexity in my life, and I don't really want to manage it. But then there's the other side of the people who are like, the most important to them is this is what happens upon my passing. Maybe I don't care about taxes, but I do care about, for sure my kids get this, and for sure my spouse is taken care of, or for sure, you know, none goes to my kids and all go to charity. I'm curious, like, I think maybe it'd be helpful to like arm advisors and how maybe they have some of these conversations.
Right. So the first point, which is more like, I really don't care about taxes. You know, I don't care about costs to my beneficiaries either. Like, I've made money, and if they want the money, like, they got to work for it, you know, go through probate. So with those, you know, clients, I think that you can push a little bit by showing them kind of like numbers, maybe, you know, making them realize that like they are potentially, you know, needlessly kind of making the net inheritance, net of taxes for their beneficiaries so much lower. But at the end of the day, sometimes you just have clients who are like, they know what they want, and you just can't do much with that. You just try your best. Oftentimes where that happens too is there's a misunderstanding, and this is where you as an advisor could try to catch where the misunderstanding is. Sometimes they're resistant to having like a revocable trust. They're just like, during my life, I don't want to live with this thing. I just want a will. And so they misunderstand that the marital trust is actually a subtrust, meaning it only kicks in once you yourself are dead. And if you have a person who's kind of like, I don't care if my heirs have to like put up with like a lot of paperwork, you're like, well, then the marital trust is like, it's not adding additional complexity, right? Like, you don't have to live with the trust.
I think that's a really important point that people don't realize, right? And I mean, not to plug Wealth, but like this is a part of Wealth's documents that can be added in as well, as this is a subtrust inside of your revocable trust.
Right. And so here's the misunderstanding. Marital trust can be built into wills. They can also be built into rev trusts. So you don't have to have a revocable trust in order to end up with the marital trust after your death. So with that client who's resistant to the revocable trust, just be like, yeah, we'll build the marital trust into your will. That's okay. But sometimes you just have clients, like you just meet them where they are. The second thing, which is about living with the administrative burden of a trust, a couple of things here to note. Sometimes where they worry is that their spouse is going to be fettered, like shackled to a trustee, and that the spouse like won't be able to just spend as they would, their inheritance. So you're saying, hey, client, put in place a trust for your spouse, your wife, for your widow, because of all these tax reasons. And they're like, yeah, but tax reasons are secondary to my spouse's ability to like live a fulsome life, not feel like they have to go to a trustee all the time. Actually, a spouse can be the trustee of that trust. So talk to the attorney about all the ways in which you can make that trust less restrictive for that client, right? They don't have a control problem. They actually have the opposite. They want to give their spouse more control. There are all sorts of things that spouse can have. You can actually give them something called a testamentary power of appointment, so that even at your spouse's death, they can completely rewrite the termination clause and change the beneficiaries through their own will, as long as they don't direct the assets in certain ways that maybe you wouldn't want. So let's say, for example, like, I don't know, you can still put some restrictions, but you can actually give a lot of power to your spouse to like even disinherit your kids, right? Because that person is not motivated by control. They actually want their spouse to have as much control as possible. They're motivated by tax. So, that's a difference as well there. And then I think the third point that you had is just, how to have that conversation with the client when they may not have wanted a marital trust and you're the first person to kind of bring up that it's a good idea for them. A couple of things to note here. It depends on what relationship you have with the estate planner as well. Some estate planners, like us at Perkins Coie, we basically didn't ask for an opinion from our clients, to be honest. It was like you came to Perkins Coie because you did have some sort of, tax planning objective, and we just explained it to the client, and it was like a given. Like, I want to say, 90% of our clients ended up with marital trusts. And so that's a little bit of like, how is the estate planner approaching that issue? Maybe coordinate with them. But the second thing to think about is reciprocity. So oftentimes there's one client who's maybe like more into the idea of the marital trust, and the other client who's maybe the one who has to live with the marital trust is like, I really don't want this. And so that's where it can get a little bit tricky, because you want it to be reciprocal, regardless of whether or not the clients end up with a joint revocable trust or two wills or two individual revocable trusts. Like, you want to coordinate what ends up happening. So either, Thomas, if you were to pass away first, you would want the marital trust for Colleen. But, Colleen, if she were to pass away first, even though she's not a fan of the marital trust, she'll set one up for you as well. So that just makes it like a little bit more equitable, right? And so the way that usually you talk to a client who's a little reluctant, or a spouse who's a little reluctant, is I always used to bring up elderly abuse, because it's so unpredictable. It happens, right? And sometimes, today you fully trust your spouse, but it's very possible that your spouse will become a vulnerable, older adult. And so just to make sure that everybody's clear on what's happening today, when everybody's together, getting along, has their wits about them, like, this is the choice that we're making as a family. And so painting it back to like, this is what we want for the second generation, or that next level beneficiary, children or charities or whatever they may be, like, this is what we agreed on together. It's actually us together making this choice.
And I think that's why it's so important to have that conversation first about what's important to you, what are those goals? Because if you lead with marital trust, you might not be able to convince somebody, but if you lead with here's what you want, well, here's how the marital trust satisfies that, that's oftentimes when people start to really connect the dots and want to implement those type of things. But
Exactly.
okay, so it seems like for the marital trust side of things, right, super impactful tool. And when we go like lower net worth, right, a lot of it is really about control. It's about making sure, hey, no matter what happens, that my kids are still taken care of, if that's what's important for you. And then as you grow, you become higher net worth, it can still be about control, but a lot of times it's really about tax advantages and being able to move all of those assets to your spouse. But what else do you think we kind of need to hit on before we wrap this up?
So I would just say there are a couple of alternatives to just doing a marital trust, right, in the blended family context. So I just wanted to quickly mention like a few that come to mind. There are others out there. But the first thing is, maybe one of the things that you might make you more comfortable with, the control question, or at least like not completely disinheriting kids from a previous relationship, is number one, give them specific gifts right at your death. Right. So instead of saying, oh, 100% has to go to my spouse and, they get to live with, all of those assets. And at the end of their lives, then the remainder goes to my kids. You can also just say, hey, I'm going to give you a token gift. And it's not token, but it's like a meaningful gift, right? To say like, just in case something happens with, your stepmom or your stepdad, like I've at least given you like a $10,000 or whatever, amount check. So that can be, that can make people feel like they got recognized. The second thing that you can do is actually set up an islet or some sort of alternative structure for that child. And so you're still giving everything that's left upon your death to your spouse, maybe even outright, but the other beneficiaries had an alternative structure in place to protect them. So maybe it's a life insurance policy within a trust that you've been paying for. So at your death, again, they get some sort of recognition, a monetary value. You can also do this through crummy trusts, things like that. Sometimes actually upon divorce, the former spouse may have, like through the agreement, like asked for something like that to be set up to protect the children from the previous relationship. So that's something else to think about. And so there are some alternatives to the marital trust. They're a little bit, specific gifts are super easy to implement, just put them in the will or the trust. But the islets and other things like that, you would want to involve, you, the advisor, and also probably an estate planner.
Yeah, those are all great, really alternatives, and that's where we have like the trust fund babies, right? You could also just have entirely set up trusts for different people and their kids, and they can start to use them at whatever age you decided on. But I think it's really, I was not thinking about the alternatives. I think there are a lot of good alternatives, but I don't know necessarily if I would say they're better. It's really goal dependent at the end of the day.
Yeah, exactly. So, Thomas, I'd be curious as you, talk about estate planning with your clients, what other structures you end up seeing for this type of situation. I think for a lot of our clients, they were in, the prototypical nuclear family, first marriage, only marriage, and then, children from that marriage. Even for them, remember again, we put together trusts for 90% of them because of the tax concern. But I think that it's totally possible to live with a marital trust. They do have to pay taxes, so I will mention the downsides, the real downsides.
Yeah.
So there is an administrative burden once that marital trust is put in place, and if it generates income in that trust, it will have to file its own income tax returns. So your CPA probably just like puts it as part of their to-do list for your client, because they'll have other structures as well and other income taxes. But the marital trust pays its own income taxes, and it pays them at a higher rate, usually on a compressed bracket from the client themselves or the spouse themselves. So there are some burdens there, and so just something to think about on that front.
All right. Well, really good info. I think this is an episode that people have been asking for a really long time. And I think you did a great job of explaining not only the advantages, the disadvantages, why even creating them, but also some alternatives. So I thought this was an awesome episode. And thanks for walking through this and helping educate me and a bunch of other advisors. And remind everybody, if you have questions or there's things you want to talk about, to email us. The email will be in the show notes. But we really appreciate you listening. Please remember to rate and subscribe, and we will see you back for an episode in a couple weeks.